1924, Notre Dame University came up with a brilliant marketing idea. By assigning the four horsemen of the book of Revelation to the four men who comprised the backfield of the football team, they created a towering opponent. The four horsemen of Notre Dame became the four horsemen of the apocalypse. But those iconic images represented the forces of death, destruction, famine, and pestilence that have trod the earth from the beginning, and those forces have shaped every world empire across human history. While most would say Plymouth Rock is where the United States began, Manhattan most certainly was the birthplace of the American spirit. What started out as a densely tree-covered island purchased for the equivalent of $24 has, over the past 2 centuries, evolved into the crossroads of the world. Nowhere on earth is there anything comparable to this 22 square miles of real estate. Today, the value of the land alone is well over $2 trillion. And that isn't even counting the 6,500 high-rises and skyscrapers that populate the city. Who, in their wildest imagination, could have foreseen that the island forest would morph into a forest of enormous towering skyscrapers? In every step, in every turn, there's a historic, iconic landmark. The buildings that reach into the heavens literally block out the sun. It's not difficult to get lost in New York, both physically and spiritually. The Empire State Building is the most famous landmark in all New York and is the world's most recognized building. Times Square is home to the most read newspaper in the world. Carnegie Hall is well over 125 years old as the aspirational destination for the world's greatest artists. Wall Street is the epicenter of the city's financial district and the world-renowned New York Stock Exchange. Madison Square Garden is one of the world's foremost sports arenas and perhaps the world's most famous. Central Park is one of the major attractions in New York City, as 37 million visit the park annually. While the Pilgrims may have landed at Plymouth, the very spirit of America was loosed when General George Washington expunged the British from Manhattan Island in the last battle of the Revolutionary War. From that moment in time forward, New York was destined to become the Empire State. Today, it is a giant magnetic vortex drawing people from the four corners of the earth. But while it is the crossroads of the world, a veritable melting pot of diverse cultures, it is a strange mixture of iron and clay that does not mix. In its raw baseness, the city is where the profane and poetic meet, but beneath the surface of mortal consciousness, it's about the prophetic, which mere mortals cannot see. New York City is a microcosm that bespeaks, in a sense, the whole world. Manhattan is the world in a nutshell. The void is global, and the global void is what has given place to a super government called the United Nations. It is this Manhattan that is the battleground for the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. It was John D. Rockefeller, one of the richest men in the world, who gave the land to the United Nations for its worldwide headquarters. Rockefeller gave the real estate to establish a headquarters for a world government that would never allow another world war. Well, there's many iconic landmarks in New York City on Manhattan Island, and this is one of them. It's one of the more recent ones, the United Nations building, and it overlooks the East River. When people come here, it's interesting, but it's kind of quiet and unassuming, and they don't understand that what they're seeing here is the headquarters for the New World Order organization called the United Nations. It's in every nation of the world except two, Palestine and Vatican City in Italy. But its reach is it's worldwide. And like I said, you only get the tip of the iceberg when you look at this place. It's everywhere.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
The swath of the global government has been growing and gaining traction, and worldwide. It is no longer just a mere presence in New York City. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the battle more fierce. But what we are watching is the very fulfillment of the prophetic. As it sits overlooking the East River, out of the way to the east side of the island, compared to the other far more colorful and popular sites, it is relatively ignored. Just not that interesting. The more spectacular venues easily capture attention, and the people simply do not apprehend the meaning of what is at hand. But there is a deep prophetic significance to the UN that goes without notice. Where did it come from? How did it get here? And how has it come over the whole world? And most importantly, how does it fit into the landscape of human history? Is it possible that what has come to Manhattan is the ghost of a former world empire? Standing in stark contrast across the street from the UN headquarters is another building. Its height, an amazing 72 stories, a third higher than the UN building's 39 stories. If the buildings could speak like the warning blast of a trumpet, what would that be? Is it a coincidence or a divine sense of humor? Here is a man named Trump, like a bugle sounding a great warning against this New World Order, or as it is in more recent days called, the deep state. It is almost as though the two great buildings are oracles memorializing and representing two conflicting paradigms, two worldviews. The UN building, a global world government, the Trump building, the nation-state inclination. Two towers speak volumes of monumental things, but their voices are drowned by the pomp and noise of the city. The money question is which representative tower will prevail. When you think of all the things that are mentioned about the great empires of the world, back to the Egyptian Empire, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, how is it possible that there's nothing in the scriptures about the enormity of New York and America? When you see it, you go, how can he possibly have missed this and not place something in the scripture about this amazing country? And not just America. When you look at the reach of the United Nations, how is it possible there's nothing in the Bible about this world-reaching global government? Yet how can we see the forest from the trees if we are standing amongst the trees? If we are to understand the times, we must take the elevator to the higher perspective. It is only from the heights that the valley is seen below. We must look backward to see forward. In order to take the elevator, we must peer into history. By looking back, there's a foreknowing of what lies ahead. History is the key to the prophetic future. The histories that have occurred on earth were written in the heavens, but recorded in symbolic language. The symbol of the beast represents history unfolding on the earth below. This physical world is a shadow world in that it follows the spiritual world. The beast of the apocalypse had 7 heads and 10 horns. The heads represented successive empires. The 10 horns, vassal states. It is a panoramic view of human time and history. Of all the landmarks in New York, apart from, of course, the Empire State Building, the Statue of Liberty is the most significant icon, maybe in America. It was given to the United States by the French to commemorate their revolution alongside of ours, which happened pretty much at the same time. So it was a gift of trying to get to be better friends with France. Money was raised by poor Jews in France, and I think they wanted it so that when they came over here, like my grandparents did at the turn of the century, and passed by the Statue of Liberty, they'd feel welcome and at home. But there's something vastly different about the American Revolution from the French Revolution. The American Revolution was a violent breakout from the grip of the British Empire. The French Revolution was actually fomented by the British banking houses. They instigated the rebellion to create an internal chaos and instability in France. In the 18th century, as France was vying to gain control of the mainland of Western Europe, the British entered into the fray. France had gained far, far too much power. The British banking houses, through political intrigue and conspiracy, introduced chaos into the French social and political systems. They did this by financing what would become the French Revolution. The French Revolution was not the action of the lower classes rising up to overthrow the aristocracy. The rebellion occurred as the bankers conscripted rabble-rousing, worthless men. It was totally a British conspiracy. So the Statue of Liberty had nothing to do with a celebration of similar revolutions. Far from it. Later, Napoleon tried to reignite the French passions to control Western Europe, and he almost succeeded, but he was stopped short in Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo. It was that famous battle that was a catalyst that accelerated globalism and the expansion of the deep state. This is a famous Waterloo Bridge that was named after the Battle of Waterloo between Napoleon and Wellington, one of the great moments in British history. But if you go way back in time, all the way back to the Egyptian Empire, there were actually 5 empires that came and went by the time of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire extended all the way up here to Britain. We're going to see more shots about where they actually set up their Londonium. But if you go way back in history, there were actually 5 empires from the time of the Egyptian Empire. It was Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo Persia, and Greece that had already come and gone in history. The 6th empire was the Roman Empire, and then there was a 7th. The 7 heads were explained as 7 mountains, and the 7 mountains are 7 kings. The mountains were not to be confused with literal mountains, but represented kings or kingdoms. At the time of the writing of the book of Revelation, the Roman Empire was the world-ruling empire, but plainly, the prophetic writings indicated that 5 of the preceding world empires had already disappeared from history. The scripture records, 5 have fallen and 1 is. The Egyptian civilization arose some 5,000 years ago. It reached its height of power around 1500 BC. The Egyptian people were a very spiritual people and firmly believed in an afterlife. Their history is well documented in hieroglyphics on the walls of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, Egypt. The Egyptian Empire became the world's strongest empire due to its military strength. This great world empire was the first of the 5 fallen kings. The second kingdom which had fallen was Assyria. The Assyrian king was known as the king of the whole world. Although the Assyrian kingdom can be traced back to 2000 BC as a world empire, it did not come into its prominence until 800 BC. The story of the Assyrian Empire is a story about its kings. These wicked kings led a proud, cruel, and warlike race. The Assyrian Empire spread out over the entire Mediterranean. It was a powerful empire for several hundred years, but declined as it gave way to the third fallen kingdom. Assyria was the second fallen head of Revelation's beast. Babylon arose to become the world's third empire. Under the great Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon invaded and conquered the known world. Nebuchadnezzar's forces overran and defeated all the countries in the Middle East. There was not a country that was spared from his mighty arm. He even destroyed the Jews' holy temple and carried off prominent Jews and kept them prisoners in Babylon for 70 years. But Babylon, the third head of the beast, came to an abrupt end at the hands of the fourth head, which was the Medo-Persian Empire. The Medo-Persian Empire, under the command of Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon in one spectacular stroke. By diverting the river Euphrates that flowed under the Great Wall of Babylon, Cyrus invaded the city, and the third great head of the beast came to an abrupt end in 558 BC. This fourth head on the beast, the Medo-Persian Empire, lasted until 330 BC. It stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia and the Black and Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. When Persia decided to invade Greece, she made a fatal mistake. The Greeks were able to stop the expansion of the empire and expel the invaders. Then Alexander the Great arose and totally conquered the Medo-Persian Empire, bringing to an end and the death of the world's fourth great empire. Greece was the fifth head of the beast. Greece was the birthplace of Western civilization. Alexander the Great conquered the entire known world. At the age of 33, Alexander died, and his kingdom was parceled out to his 4 generals. Its vast dimensions stretched across the world. It ceased to be a world empire in 146 BC. With the end of the Grecian Empire, the 5 of the heads on the beast had ceased to be. Then there was the head that is described as the one that is. It was the 6th head of the beast, the Roman Empire. It had the dubious place in history for killing the King of Kings. It was the 6th mountain of the beast symbol. The Roman Empire ended in 476 AD. The symbol of the beast, with the 7 heads and 10 horns, is representing a system of empires strung together over the course of thousands of years. Then the prophecy says it was not. When the Roman Empire ended, there was not a regent head of the beast for over 1,000 years, but it would rise again centuries later in the 7th head. The prophetic scriptures explained that after a long period of time from the fall of the Roman Empire, there would be no regent head on the beast system for hundreds and hundreds of years. Then, about 1600, the 7th head began to emerge. Then, out of the abyss, arose the 7th empire, the British Empire. The famously named Waterloo Bridge is more than a common and convenient passageway for people to cross the Great Thames River. The bridge itself bisects at the exact point where the river takes an abrupt 90-degree change in direction. Is it the luck of the planners, a happenstance, or under closer scrutiny, a prophetic metaphor forthtelling the monumental 90-degree turn in British history when the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. When the Rothschilds' agents positioned to observe the Battle of Waterloo became aware of Napoleon's imminent defeat, they quickly secreted the important information across the English Channel to the waiting, expectant hands of Rothschild. The knowledge of who won the battle would have tremendous impact and significantly affect the financial markets of Western Europe. Rothschild was well aware he was being intently watched by the other brokers. In a brilliant move, he ingeniously sold his shares of stock. Those who watched his every move likewise sold off their portfolios. The market fell, collapsing downward like a rock. But unbeknownst to all the brokers was that Rothschild, through his proxies, was actually buying up all the sold-off stock at pennies on the dollar. Consequently, in one day, Rothschild became the richest man in all the world. The Battle of Waterloo was the great moment in what would become the point where the explosive growth of the British Empire would ensue in the 19th century, and Rothschild became the master of the ship. It is no coincidence that the great bronze statue of the Duke of Wellington is standing in front of the British Exchequer Stock Exchange right across the street from the Bank of England. It was paying tribute to the man who made it all happen, and it was all paid for by the city crown, now firmly in the control by Rothschild. And the scepter of power enjoyed by the monarchy system would move to the city of London, also known as the Crown. After the Duke of Wellington defeated Napoleon, he became Prime Minister of England. Subsequently, this arch memorialized the great man. The horses and armed military that ride through this archway lead to Buckingham Palace, and the Arch of Wellington serves as a door to the home of the monarchy and Queen's House, the alleged seat of power. But the daily parade of pomp and pageantry serve only to maintain an appearance, an illusory appearance. The Queen is only a figurehead of power. The real power lies with the crown, and the crown is not the same as the monarchy. The real gate or passageway to the ruling power is the Tower Bridge, because it leads directly to the city of London, which is the crown. So the archway of the Duke and the pomp and pageantry of the monarchy is maintained to keep the knowledge of the crown and its power from being understood. The beautiful Tower Bridge is so named because it passes right by the Tower of London. The Tower of London was a fortress built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. He brought his authority to the north bank of the Thames and set up shop. During that time, he issued a paperwork that continues to this day. The writ established the city as a corporation. It was called the Crown. Again, not to be confused with the monarchy. The famous crown jewels belong to the city, not to the Queen or the monarchy, and that is why they are kept in the city, in the fortress or Tower of London. The Queen is, however, allowed to wear the crown jewels on special occasions. When Rothschild became the richest man in the world after Waterloo, he became the de facto head of the city, and the City of London was the authority over the British Empire. Permit me to control and issue the money of a nation, and I care not who makes the laws. These words, uttered by Rothschild, became the guiding principle. But Nathan Rothschild not only controlled the currency of the empire, he also owned the East India Company. It was the East India Company that was the engine of British imperialism in the 19th century. But before we take a look at the engine for British imperialism, the East India Company, let's take a step backward in time. Just what was it in the spirit and DNA of Nathan Rothschild that was motivating him to expand the British Empire to global proportions? Nathan was one of 5 brothers sent by his father across Europe to set up private independent banking houses. His father, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, was a brilliant man who taught his sons the ins and outs of banking. He had learned the trade when becoming good friends with the King of France and was entrusted by the king to keep a great cache of his gold. Meyer, a Jewish man, was a smart man and would have frequent debates with the learned rabbi. It was then that he found the scripture, "You will lend, but you will not borrow." He took the scripture as his calling. Meyer changed his name from Bauer to Rothschild and repudiated the religious side of his Jewish pedigree. He became an atheistic Jew. It was at this point he began to lend out the gold, dispersing it to his sons, who in turn began to loan out the money to kings. They loaned it out at interest, and they too became wealthy, as had their father. As the Rothschilds' international banks of Europe became more and more wealthy, Mayer Amschel Rothschild had an epiphany when he had met Adam Weishaupt. The white horse is that which goes out conquering and to conquer. Throughout history, the temptation offered by the white horse has been extended to a certain type of man on earth. Jesus was offered the opportunity to have all the kingdoms of the world, but of course, he declined. But the white horse has been riding on the earth for some time, and there were certain men in history that accepted the offer, and history is replete with them. Ramesses II of Egypt was considered a god, and he ruled over the known earth. But there were many others. The Assyrian kings, Alexander the Great, Constantine, Charles Martel, Genghis Khan, and then there was Adam Weishaupt of Bavaria, a lesser man known in history, but nonetheless one who accepted the offer of the white horse. All these men became megalomaniacs with great mental diseases, accompanied with delusions of grandeur. Adam Weishaupt was a Jew who converted to Catholicism and became a Jesuit priest, but he became disillusioned with both religion and political systems. He thus repudiated both. He had a vision of something else beyond the external constraints of governments and religious orders. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was passing through a similar change of mind. In the caprice of time, the two men met. It was at this point in human history that Mayer Amschel Rothschild had his epiphany. It was the white horse moment. On May 1st, 1776, 2 months before America's Declaration of Independence, when the Order of the Illuminati was launched. The white horse of the apocalypse was riding. The echo that had reverberated down through time had caught the ear of these two men. The mantle of Mayer Rothschild would then fall upon Nathan, his most brilliant son. The London Museum inside the city overlooks one of the last remnants of the far-reaching Roman Empire, which reached all the way north to London. This is what remains of the Roman wall that was built in the 1st century AD. But strangely, there is almost more evidence of the Roman presence in London 2,000 years ago than any record of the East India Company or even the Rothschilds. It's almost as though their history has been redacted from British history. From the time of the disbanding of the East India Company in 1874, there are scant records of either in British affairs. It is only at the British Maritime Museum that we can pick up any scent or any footprint of the company. But for the East India Company, it was all about seizing world trade at any price, and that is why the company attacked China, the leading exporter of goods and services in the world at that time. But at the root of the outward aggression to capture world trade was the philosophy or the dialectic, the means justify the ends. In other words, whatever it takes to accomplish the goal of a global state, patterned after the British Empire, so be it. This was the guiding principle and justification for the imperialistic drive for a centralized global New World Order. And that premise, the germinal seed, was framed by the East India House. It was the guiding light of the East India Company, and the company was violent, merciless, and cruel. The dark and deceived luminaries that populated the house wholeheartedly believed in their humanitarian goodness and it was their justification and enough to proceed with establishing a global world government. The many philosophical facets of thought represented by each member coalesced into the belief for a global socialized state, and they all were social engineers. It should come as no surprise that while John Stuart Mill presided as conductor over this strange orchestration of men, that one of the leading proponents of the group was Karl Marx. He and his personal mentor, Friedrich Engels, were the fathers of communism, and both lived in the city of London, and both were employed by Nathan Rothschild to construct the doctrine of socialism. His most infamous work was Das Kapital, that posited that pseudo-idealistic idea that the state would rule absolutely and in all the affairs of man. A totalitarian government that must needs rule with a rod of iron, but with extreme cruelty, a la Nietzsche. This totalitarian state would thus reduce the masses to a neo-serfdom, calling for the elimination of the middle class. There could be no upward economic mobility. Like the proverbial frog unsuspectingly being boiled in water, so too the masses would be slowly taxed to death. Thus the totalitarian state would become global via the stepping stone of the shroud of a global socialism. This was Marxism. Charles Darwin was also a member of the East India House. His contribution in establishing a new world order was in creating a rational explanation for the existence of man. This scientific approach was a direct attack on the Judeo-Christian explanation of creation. In order to break down the foundation of Western civilization, there must come a new foundation to replace the old. Western civilization, including the United States worldview, comes from the Old Testament book of Genesis and the New Testament scriptures. For there to be a new world order, there must needs be a radically different foundation. Darwin and Darwinism was the major torpedo. Another member of this so-called wise men group and learned elders was Thomas Malthus. Malthus invented the discipline of race science called eugenetics. Since in nature we know a tree by its fruit, by looking at two proponents and students of Malthus, we get a clue into the twisted nature of this power and reach of the East India House. Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood in the early part of the 20th century, wholeheartedly embraced Thomas Malthus' philosophy and views, and why she supported abortion as a means to cull down the birth of black people's babies. These people to her were an unfit, inferior race whose presence was a drag on society and created so many problems in society that there needed to be a solution: abortion. Her solution was right out of the cruel and violent playbook of Thomas Malthus, creator of eugenetics. But there was another former son of the craft of eugenetics. His name? Adolf Hitler, whose solution to the Jewish problem was the Holocaust, a systematic cleansing of an inferior race, taking the whole lot of them off the face of the earth. This horrific event in the 20th century is a grim testimony to the repulsive and satanic effect of eugenetics from Thomas Malthus and the East India House. John Ruskin, another of the great learned elders, one of the great scholars, art critics, and intellectual thinkers of the day, added fuel to the fire in that as a Christian, he advanced Christian socialism by expounding on biblical references to support the same view. He advanced a concept of legislated socialism, which is contrary to the idea and principle of a man's free will, but it muddied the water. Ruskin would lecture at Oxford and Cambridge University, and his dark, persuasive lectures caught the ear of one Cecil J. Rhodes. Rhodes, as a result, became the most outspoken proponent and the one best articulating of the vicissitudes and then the responsibility of the British culture to be taught all over the world. Rhodes became so influential that Rothschild funded his diamond operation, the De Beers Mining Company, in South Africa. So great was Rhodes' influence that the country of Rhodesia in South Africa was named after him, and the people who fell in line with his doctrine were awarded with Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford and Cambridge to further their indoctrination into the vision of a global world empire. These are just a few of the many that comprise the think tank of the East India House. Today, the East India House is called the Chatham House. But even before the explosive growth of the seventh head of the beast, the British Empire, and its acceleration by the Rothschilds, there was an element of world conquest within the British Empire. Remember, the white horse supersedes and overshadows the earth. This is the famous Westminster Abbey Church in London. Not far from here, in a smaller church called St. Mary's, America's most famous traitor is buried. Now, why would a traitor from the United States be buried in a church in London? It's a little-known fact in American history that General George Washington had a profound suspicion and disrespect for his military subordinate, Benedict Arnold, who actually fought with the American Revolutionary Forces against the British invaders. And yet in London, at St. Mary's Church, Arnold was provided a final resting place, entombed in the church. These facts are ignored in the history books, but they provide a window into the past in how cunning and dangerous was the British spy system. Benedict Arnold was not just a traitor, he was a British spy for the British Empire. In England, Benedict Arnold was regarded as a hero. At the time, had Washington looked more deeply, his suspicions would have led him to discover that Arnold had a comrade in arms, in one Aaron Burr. Burr, too, was a British spy, but so well trained that he was able to bore his way into the political fabric of the fledgling country and rise to become Vice President of the United States of America. Had it not been for Alexander Hamilton throttling his right of political power, Burr would have become President of the United States. But the enmity between the two reached to the boiling point. At issue was the matter of banking. Hamilton, who would later become enshrined on the $10 bill, argued for a central bank of the USA, operated by American nationals. Burr, on the other hand, the British plant, argued for a central bank operated by internationalists, that is, the Rothschilds. The hostilities between the two climaxed in a famous duel that ensued at this park in now New Jersey. It was at this park that Burr shot Hamilton with one shot, and he died. For his position on the matter, Hamilton became known as the father of the American banking system. But the duel between the two men, for those willing to take a closer look, was a prophecy of what was to ensnare the American nation over the next 100 years. It would point to the violent and virulent nature of the British Empire's unrelenting pursuit through banking, what they saw as the recapture of the American renegades. And after the Empire's failure to defeat the Americans in the First Revolutionary War, there began a great strengthening and preparation for a secondary invasion. The Navy was bolstered significantly, and its landed army expanded to 260,000 men. The army was twice the size of the British Standing Army. In fact, the British East India Company had the largest army in the world. Emboldened by its muscular growth, the plans were prepared for another assault on America. On the inside of the American government, at the helm of the Secretary of Treasury, was one Albert Gallatin. If not a spy, surely he was a traitor and a British puppet. While the British East India Company was gearing up for another war, Gallatin made certain that the American defenses were substantially weakened. Contrary to the East India Company buildup, funded of course by Rothschild, the American military was unfunded by Gallatin. Albert Gallatin refused to build up the American Navy with the much-needed capital to strengthen the defensive protection to ward off the coming British assault. Hence, Gallatin paved the way for the War of 1812, the Second Revolutionary War with the British Empire. There really is no way to explain how the American nation survived except were it by divine intervention. Certainly the hand of the Almighty was with the American people. The next crisis to arrive would Company were becoming so apparent, so blatant to the world that its existence was becoming counterproductive to the establishing of a new world order. The image or perception of the crown, of course controlled by Rothschild, was being greatly tarnished. Something had to be done. There would be other ways to go about the business of globalism. The Rothschilds and East India Company must needs disappear and redact themselves as best they possibly could from British history. The British Parliament came to the rescue at bequest of the monarchy. But what is very strange with that arrangement is that the British Parliament had no jurisdictional authority over the Crown, the City of London. How could the Parliament make a ruling over the East India Company, which was a possession of the Crown, which of course was owned by Rothschild? But the East India House and the cadre of brilliant intellectuals, the think tank, and Rothschilds were like the Wizard of Oz hiding behind the curtain. And yet while they were hidden from plain view, they would leave footprints in the sands of history. Yet these huge personalities and major players on the world scene unknowingly are mere pawns acting out what has been written in the heavens. The prophetic word has been written so that while the world falls deeper and deeper under the cloud of globalism, God's people would not be overcome by the trap coming over the whole world. The four horsemen of the apocalypse are not written to frighten men, but are given as an explanation of what would come upon the earth. In other words, this is what will happen, and this is the world you live in. It cannot be fixed, but we must not allow the outer world to pull us down. The inner man, therefore, must be strengthened to stand against the evil day. It will come over the whole earth. The red horse of the apocalypse was loosed to gallop the circle of the earth once again at the end of the Civil War, when the banking elite virtually went rogue by becoming invisible. The final disposition of its purpose was to take peace from the earth, but now on a global scale. On the earth below, it would take several decades for the manipulators to set up the conditions for the outbreak of the great wars in the 20th century. Beyond the characters on the ground pulling the strings, the prophetic picture in the heavens, in the red horse, declared the inevitability of what would come to pass on the earth. All the wranglings on the ground that did occur was only the shadow following what was written in the heavens, and written for our benefit so that we could understand the day in which we live. Papa George Washington said it this way: "Shall a few designing men, for their own aggrandizement and to glorify their own avarice, overset the godly fabric we have been rearing at the expense of much time, blood, and treasure?" But Washington's clarion cry was not something that would deter the rich and powerful from their goal. These designing players instinctively knew a massive war chest was necessary to pull down the nation-state system and replace it with a new world order. There had to be a world war. In the 1890s, the rich and powerful banking houses of both Europe and the United States were summoned to break the grip of the nation-state system. Together, by contracting credit, they dried up the flow of money in the United States and created the economic conditions of a depression in 1907. The lack of money caused a terrible slowdown in the economy and caused a great cry for a solution to the misery. The answer was to create a central bank that could provide loans and credit to get the economy back on its feet again. Never again would the nation be without a money supply. But while the bankers conspired to create the economic conditions for the central bank, this time it would be under the control of internationalists, the exact issue that brought Hamilton and Burr to a duel 100 years earlier. The bankers secretly met at a rich man's retreat off the coast of Georgia at a place called Jekyll Island. With the conditions ripe, they crafted a plan called the Federal Reserve Act, but it had to be approved by Congress. In order for Congress to approve the act, it had to be tendered at the precise moment in time. It was decided that it would be December 23rd, 1912, when most of the members of Congress were home for Christmas. But there was one more obstacle that had to be overcome. They had to have a president in office who would not veto the bill. They had 2 years to recruit such a man and maneuver him into the office of the presidency. They found such a candidate at Princeton University. The president of Princeton University was a man named Woodrow Wilson. He was courted by the British plant Colonel Mendel House. House, the operative of the city, was a spy, but so clever that he actually became Wilson's mentor. With Wilson under control, the city had their American puppet, and when the election came, they made sure of his election by running William Howard Taft, the Republican, against the ever-popular Republican Teddy Roosevelt, thus splitting the Republican vote. Wilson, the liberal Democrat, won the election and thus the presidency, becoming the 28th President of the United States. The passage of the Federal Reserve Act was assured, and it became the law of the land in 1913. Thus, the setup of the war chest to finance a global world war was in place. All it would take for the Red Horse to ride over the earth was a spark that would ignite a world war. The spark that came was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria when he was shot down in the street. From that point, the conflict accelerated into a global world at war. Peace had been taken from the earth. The Red Horse's hoofs had touched down on the earth. Whether one attempts to explain the conflagration in human design or is a deep conspiracy, one thing is for certain. The Red Horse, who brandishes the great sword and was given to take peace from the earth, had touched down as all the world went to war. From the point of the assassination and ensuing war, the British Empire, the seventh head of the beast, began to die. Its light and power began to leak away. On the other side of the Atlantic, over in the United States, Wilson regaled in the shepherding in of the Federal Reserve Bank. His first administration was coming to an end. In order to regain political momentum, while the war raged on in Europe, he ran on the campaign promise, "He will keep us out of the war." As no one in the States had the stomach for war, his promise succeeded and he was reelected. But within weeks after his reelection, America entered World War I. In order to finance her contribution to the Great War effort, America needed to borrow money, and money she borrowed in great sums from the Federal Reserve Central Bank. There had to be a way to prevent another world war. The world sentiment was ripe for the idea and creation of a super government. The idea that was floated philosophically was that if a majority of nations would come together and surrender their sovereignty to a super government, then that super government could effectively maintain world peace, as no rogue nation would dare attack the combined will of the superstate. The world delegates met at France at Versailles to determine how the spoils of war would be parceled out, and then what would be the fate of Germany in reparations, and how the nations of the world could move forward. There in Europe, the overseers came up with a plan with 14 points for a new world order. The 14th point was for a League of Nations. The League of Nations, of course, was a euphemism for a new world order. Woodrow Wilson was assigned the task of selling the charter to the United States Congress. Without the United States in the League, there could be no new world order. Wilson, the great orator, failed to sell the plan in the United States, and the League of Nations failed, never materializing. To the dismay of the international bankers' cabal, they could not pull the rabbit out of the hat. But their irrepressible drive called for a regrouping. They simply would not be denied. They huddled up and called a new play.
Alles, was ihr seid, seid ihr durch mich. Und alles, was ich bin, bin ich nur
A
durch
rising
euch.
star in Germany who espoused the Marxist view of socialism as a means to a powerful central state government appeared on the horizon.
Sieg heil!
He was perceived admirably by the banking interest on both sides of the Atlantic, but especially by Wall Street bankers. This potential candidate, they reasoned, could be harnessed to reignite the war in Europe. Hitler founded the National Socialist Party, also known as the Nazi Party. Initially, its goal was a National Socialist Germany state. He was viewed as the perfect man to back with funds to re-establish the globalist plans as he fully embraced socialism. The Wall Street bankers funded Hitler, seeking to use him as a tool for their misconstrued ends. But they could not see nor envision that Hitler was a megalomaniac and had bigger dreams than a mere National Socialistic state. They had no idea that he would get out of hand. Hitler would go on to recruit Japan and Italy for his vision of world domination. Hitler's diabolical answer to the atheistic Jewish bankers' grip was to kill all of the Jews, the whole damn race of them. He called the Holocaust the final solution. Hitler went global, and World War II commenced when he attacked Poland in 1939. Japan and Italy joined later.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
I shall not attempt to prophesy whether the frenzy of a cornered maniac will drive Herr Hitler into the worst of all his crimes. But this I will say, without a doubt, that the fate of Holland and Belgium, like that of Poland, Czechoslovakia and Austria, will be decided by the victory of the British Empire.
Hitler's madness was brought to an end after 6 years of war. Some 80 million people died. Western Europe lay in ruins, but the bankers became far more wealthy. This time, though, the world was utterly exhausted, and there would be no more resistance to a new world order. The seventh head of the beast, the British Empire, was gone. It had been slain, erased from the world scene, and out of the 7 heads of the beast came the 8th head, just as it is recorded in prophetic scripture. But this time it would be called the United Nations, and the 8th arose out of the 7. When you look back through time and history and all the empires of the world that have come and gone, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then the 7th, the British Empire that covered the whole earth, it seems very clear that the emerging 8th head is the United Nations. I'm Ken Klein. Many of the dots have been connected as we've watched history come alive through the revealing of the great beast of Revelation. But there's so much more that remains to be uncovered. The most important and significant is the closely guarded mystery of the second beast, the so-called false prophet. It's the false prophet who brings down the final curtain and plays the last trump. It's all here in this book, The Deep State Prophecy and the Last Trump. You can get your copy at Amazon.com.